So we are in the last of this series. I love that song. It's sort of like an E. E. Cummings poem that speaks to this mystery that we long for when we long for Jesus, when we long to know God, when we long to find that sacred ground which we can trust, which we can lean on, and yet it's filled with a mystery that we don't understand at times. Somewhat like a jackal, somewhat like a swan, sometimes a strange mystery, the source of both hope and the source of both dread. That song to me speaks of the beginning of Holy Week. That song to me speaks of the strangeness and awkwardness of this guy who's the Savior riding in on a donkey into Jerusalem. It speaks to that craziness, and yet there's that deep longing that's part of us. I want to go to our first slide if we can, Ian. So can you all see this? No, I blocked it, didn't I? There we go. We'll go back and forth with this thing. So it's one of my favorite cartoons. I don't know if you guys love Calvin and Hobbes like I do. I think this guy Watterson is an amazing philosopher as far as I can. And Calvin just represents the humanity. Let's say life in this square of the sidewalk. We're born at this crack and we die at that crack. And I love Hobbes, just staring, just observing. Now we find ourselves somewhere inside this square. And in the process of walking out of it, suddenly we realize our time in here is fleeting. I love how he's just pleading with the concrete. Is our quick experience here pointless? Does it say anything? Does anything we say or do in here really matter? Have we done anything important? Have we been happy? Have we made the most of these precious few footsteps? And they're still there in the middle of the night wondering. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke to this idea of how we often find ourselves. Now bring it out here. I'm going to have to go back and forth. I got 4 slides. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be a little crazy, but that's all right. I spoke about this way in which we face sort of the dark woods in our life. The gift of the dark wood, Eric Elm's book, speaks to sort of the existential reality of who we are. We experience life, things happen, they shut down the way we think things are supposed to go. Our narrative, if we think about the way we tell our stories, we often tell them as though, A is supposed to go to B, and then B is supposed to get to C, and then after a little while, depending on how far we get through the alphabet, then we end up getting back to A eventually. We sort of, it's sort of like A plus, or maybe A primed or something. I haven't figured out. Maybe it's A flat. It's retirement. So I don't know what it is. But it's basically, we go full circle. We sort of made our way through life and everything was just fine. But that's not really the way life is most of the time. For most of us, we're moving along in our life and then something happens. Maybe it's one of our kids. It's just somehow, how could the kid we raised up so well suddenly become a meth addict? Maybe it's our own lives. We find ourselves out of a job. The job was perfect. Everything. What went wrong with the job? Completely out of our hands. We lose the job. Something happens, and we find ourselves in this strange, unfamiliar place, like Calvin standing in this middle of the sidewalk, going like, "What's it all been for? Then what's the purpose of all of this?" And that's where Eric Elm says is the dark wood. That's the invitation. That's not the crisis, it's the invitation. Because suddenly we realize life has always been bigger than us. Life has always been more mysterious than us. We just thought we could predict it. We just thought we were in control. And so he suggests that when you find yourself then here in the dark wood, then our choices, or our gifts, the gifts here, are the opportunity to experience this lostness as a way of letting go, the opportunity to experience this uncertainty as a gift of recognizing questions are all right. Questions are invitations to discover more, to open our horizons more. And then, of course, today, that there's this gift of the Misfit Community that I want to think with you about in particular. But here's the interesting thing. I talked about, and I want you to kind of keep thinking about this. I had several people ask me about this afterwards. I have no idea if you can even see this in the back. A little bit. Okay. All right. So narrative styles. I talked about this. I know it's a kind of a technical term. A writer named Arthur Franks came up with this a while back. But we tell stories about ourselves. And even if we're not telling stories, we're living our life out in a certain kind of story fashion. Whether it's the American dream, whether it's the culture we grew up in, whether it's the suburban culture we had, or the family culture we had, we live our lives in a narrative fashion. He says what happens is that when we enter this dark wood, then what typically happens is that we go through a time of chaos, right? Well, that makes sense. Disorientation is not as we understood. And then typically one of two things happen. Either we seek restitution, we seek to get it fixed. Most of our culture is centered around a restitutional narrative. Most of our culture is centered around things being broken, things being fixed. Even if you didn't know it was broken, look at any advertisement. It will tell you it's broken. All you need to do is buy this and that will fix it, right? I mean, we live in a broken culture. It's a consumer-oriented culture. How are you going to buy something if you don't know you need it? So we have this restitutional model. Well, that makes it a little difficult for us when our whole culture is oriented around this as well. But this idea that we just get it fixed. Of course, the challenge is, in many cases, things don't fix so easily. And what happens is we end up, for many people, going back and forth between this place of chaos, this place of restitution, back into this chaos. And what Arthur Frank said is that there's another way to see life, that if we thought about story the way we read a good story, we would recognize this in our own lives. Any good story is centered around a crisis. But what moves the crisis along is not just the character, but their willingness to enter into that mystery and to begin to draw off the gifts that are there. Whether it's someone who is an aid to them, whether it's some wise person they had not expected, whether it's some sudden discovery or insight that moves them along, or whether it's the wound itself that becomes the gift and helps to propel them along. They recognize that they are in the middle of a bigger story, and we want to read because we want to know what happens. Well, to me, that's what was so promising about Arthur Frank's idea, is this idea of living in the midst of, that we're in the middle of our stories, that we're living out this quest. So what Eric says then is that in addition to those gifts of lostness, gifts of mystery, gifts of uncertainty, there is the gift of the misfit. Now, this is what I want to think with you for just a little bit. And I want to talk with you particularly about the misfit community. When we think of misfits, well, number one, if I asked you how many of you are misfits in here, how many would you be willing to raise your hand? Anybody misfit? See, you all see yourself as misfits. Now, I'd be curious of why that is. But when I saw this, Linda looked at me and said, "Oh, your community is going to like amen." I mean, they're like, you're preaching to the choir here, the misfit community. And it's like, well, I wonder what that's all about. Misfits are the idea of misfit, of course, the word literally means, I don't fit. I don't fit. Well, now, many of us might have come out of a more traditional background, out of a more orthodox culture. We found this as a non-orthodox, it's untraditional. It feels kind of open, and so we might identify ourselves as misfit. We didn't fit. But here's the thing about misfits that's very curious. Getting back to this narrative style, the challenge here, in order to get out of seeing it that everything has to be fixed, is to stop seeing ourselves as a victim. And that's the key to what's really different about being in the misfit community. Because we're not actually a community of victims. But the challenge is getting out of that identity of seeing ourselves as not fitting in. Because when we say we don't fit in, what we're actually saying is that we're kind of broken. If that's the norm, then we're kind of broken. Or if that's the norm, then they're kind of broken. Somebody's broken here. So we identify one or the other as misfits. You remember the old joke I told I've told it so many times in here about the guy that goes in the bar and that tells everybody that Democrats are just, horses' rear ends and they beat him up. Republicans are horses' rear ends, they beat him up. He's beat up out in the ground. He says, "What's the matter with you people?" And he says, "This is horse country." Right? It's bigger, right? It's bigger. That's the trick. The trick is to realize it's bigger. We are grounded in a much larger mystery. But until we start to recognize that we're part of this bigger mystery, we go back and forth between restitution and chaos, trying to find our place. We don't fit in. We celebrate the misfits. There's that wonderful Steve Jobs quote that some of you all have seen, that YouTube video. It came out right before they started pushing another Apple product. And it's a great ad. Celebrates those misfits like Martin Luther King Jr., like Einstein, like some of the great artists, all these crazy individuals and interests, and celebrates them as misfits. And then sort of identifies you as part of that misfit culture. That's why you like to buy Apple products, right? The bigger picture. That's the challenge, I think, always, is to see the bigger picture and how we fit in that picture. We're no longer refugees. We're no longer victims. We're part of a big story. And now where do we find ourselves in the midst of that story? I think the gift of the misfit community is recognizing those who also recognize we're just in this dark, mysterious place. Let's go there together. Socrates, who was killed for this, incidentally, Socrates said, you know why I'm the smartest man of all? It's because if there's one thing I know, it's that I don't know what I don't know. If there's one thing I know for sure, is that I know what I don't know. Or that I know that I don't know what I don't know. Yeah. I'm not sure I know that yet. But I don't know what I don't know. And that's really threatening to a lot of people. Because they want to get back here. They want to fix it. It's uncomfortable being in mystery. We want to know that something besides us is in control, and if we just do right, then that's going to take care of us. Or eventually, if we're like with Joel Osteen, I'm sorry if you're a big Joel Osteen fan, but he's a nice example of this. You just got to keep waiting. It's going to happen for you. It's going to get right for you. And maybe it will. But in a lot of cases, it just goes back and forth. It's missing the point of what God is about in the midst of our world. Well, at least that's what I think, but I don't know what I don't know, so some of you go ahead and get up and leave. You're like, I was here for answers, I'm out of here. Would you throw up the next picture, please? See how we're doing on time here. So here's a picture of Old Jerusalem in Jesus' time. Can you guys see that? Okay. I'm going to get my exercise. So here's a picture of Temple and Jerusalem in Jesus' time. Now, when Jesus is coming in from the Mount of Olives, so you see that on the on the east side. He's coming in from the Mount of Olives, and he's heading into the temple. That's Solomon's temple area in the right upper corner there. He's coming into this highly religious, traditional, deeply orthodox setting where all the Pharisees, the priests, everyone who's been challenged by his very presence, he's coming in, but he's not coming in a typical royal fashion to fulfill what the prophet Zechariah had said. He's coming in on a donkey. Now, if you look over to the left, you'll see the upper city there on the left, and then suburb, which is kind of down low. You'll see traditional Golgotha where they think the Calvary is. That little square to the left side where it says upper city, that's Herod's temple, that's Solomon's temple. That whole area is the region where all of the Roman Empire have had their emperors. And what's fascinating is that the gate, which you can hardly see there, is right next to it. So that whenever Caesar, any of the emperors would come into the city, they came in through that gate. A huge celebration, chariots and carriages and soldiers and fanfare. And it's almost as if Jesus is doing political theater here. Now, the way the writer Marcus Borg says is he says that at the time of Passover, which is where we would be about this time with Holy Week, at the time of Passover, Jesus is coming in on one side, and Caesar Antipas, anyway, is coming in on the other side. He acts as if they're both happening at the same time, which is really kind of debatable. But what would be known by everyone is that this is totally ironic. It's totally out of place for Jesus to come in. It's totally misfit for him to come in from this side on a donkey like this. But think of Jesus' life, how he's lived most of his life. Most of it has been in a misfit way. Hanging out with Samaritans, hanging out with tax collectors. Jesus saying everybody belongs in the kingdom. Saying something crazy in the early part of the Gospel of Matthew and Luke to the disciples when he says, guess what? You keep looking for the kingdom of God. It's already among you. It's already within you. It's already between you. It's already here happening. That's just radical. It doesn't make any sense. Because part of the thing it doesn't do, it doesn't fix anything to say the kingdom of heaven is here now. It doesn't fix anything. It says, live with one another in the mystery. Love your neighbor as yourself. That was his teaching. That's what the Old Testament had in Micah. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. The narrative is the quest. It's living in the misfit community together in this darkness. I had this great experience. So let's go to the next picture. See if I can wrap some things up here. Oh, thank you. All right, thank you. Okay, I don't know if you can see this, everybody. I just got to tell you. Diane Fisher, where's Diane Fisher? Diane Fisher's involved every year with this weekend for the deaf and hearing impaired of Texas for high school students. And they put on this amazing weekend at TCC. And I've had the joy and privilege and honor of being invited to be a part of that for the last several years. And to do drumming with the deaf and hearing impaired. So it's a great way to kick off Holy Week. I expect more of you to show up now, drumming on Tuesday. So go back though. Don't get away from that too fast. I'm proud of this. Go back to that. I put 35 big drums in my Mini Cooper. They said it couldn't be done. But I have 35 drums, an amplifier, and 3 gigantic singing bowls in my Mini Cooper. And but to tell you the truth, I used the church van to take them back. That took me 2 hours to do that. Okay, now go to the next picture. It's such a profound experience working with the deaf and hearing impaired to do drumming. Number one, some of these students are profoundly deaf, so they can't hear anything at all. If they're lucky, they begin to feel vibration, but that's the magic of it, is if you can get everyone together in a circle playing on the drums, but not necessarily looking for the drum beat and what each other's playing, but feeling the rhythm together. If you can get to that place, they start to smile because they realize somehow, maybe they don't realize this explicitly, but implicitly they realize somehow they're in the same place. They feel it together. And it's not easy to get there, especially with the hearing impaired, and it's always a challenge. But the stories that happen, so you see the sign interpreter on the right, and he's trying to call out what I'm saying, and then I've got an amplifier and a subwoofer, and I'm getting ready to turn it up because the young woman there, who's Muslim, and her name's Amima, and she said it's all right to show her picture, and just a beautiful woman. She was on the other side, a high school student. She's 20. She lived in Pakistan up until 3 years ago. She had never spoken in any language. She had only read lips in Urdu, reading Urdu. And she had done some handwriting notes and stuff, but basically, as her teacher was telling me, communication in her family and in her community was just rudimentary. And for the most part, she was pretty much excluded. She was broken, right? She just didn't fit in at all. And so it was very difficult. When she came to the United States, you see the smile on her face. Turns out that's what Amima means in Urdu, is smile. And when she came to the U.S., she learned sign language, and she said her teacher said that what she said is, I have a voice, and people can hear my story. Isn't that fascinating? To imagine that no one can hear your story, but now someone can hear your story. I didn't know this about her. I just saw her sitting on one side, and I thought, well, she seems to be able to keep rhythm. And so I said, would you mind being the rhythm keeper for the group? And she had the best time because it really makes a loud boom when you're banging on that with the amplifier to it. We can go to the next picture just to show some of the other group. I saw 6 groups like this, about 25 to 30 students each. Here's another young man here on the left side. They took a pan picture, so as you're looking at it, people are being split apart, so that's why it looks a little weird. They did a pano. But the guy on the left there in the blue shirt, he's from China. He's been here in the United States for 2 years. And also a similar story. But when I started playing with singing bowls, he smiled and he says, my parents grew up Buddhist. And that's what we do. And when they go to temple, they play the singing bowls. And he just said, he was so surprised to see it here, right? So, I mean, stories collide when we give them an opportunity to. And it reminds us the world is so much bigger than our little narratives, that the narratives are so much wider and more possible. And that's what I think it means to be in this community of misfits. That's what I think it means to be in this community in the ground of being with God at the source of our lives, is this idea that we are all a part of God's creation, that we are all a part of God's being. God's being is a part of all of us. Would you throw the Goethe quote up? I think it's next. Eric Elnes has this as the beginning of his Misfit chapter, and I love this quote by Goethe. The world is so empty. If one thinks only of mountains, rivers, and cities, the world is so empty if one thinks only of mountains, rivers, and cities. But to know someone who thinks and feels with us, and who, though distant, is close to us in spirit, this makes the earth for us an inhabited garden. What a beautiful sentiment. This idea that we are in the dark wood together. You're really not misfits. Maybe you are. Some of you, I admit, are weirder than others. Some of you are happily so. And some, I am a strange person in many different ways. There's not too many people that stuff a bunch of drums in a mini and go drum with deaf students. But at the same time, we're not all that different. What distinguishes us as the misfit community is that we've stepped out of what seems to be the restitutional sort of way of looking at life. Maybe the vertical way of looking at God and faith, that God is here to fix things when things break, but instead looking at the horizontal way of faith that Jesus had taught so much of, is to be present with one another in ways that change each other's lives. So that even after I'm gone, and even after Amima has left, Amima now realizes there's a story a little bit bigger than what she'd experienced up until yesterday. And even what the young boy from China discovered, there's a story that's bigger than what he thought. There are surprising places where a Buddhist suddenly feels at home. The world is so much bigger. To be in the misfit community is to realize that what we do know is that we don't know what we don't know. But that's wonderful. And we're here together in this community. Amen.